Beautiful calendar.
Your head fell off my phone.
Okay, so we're live. Good morning. It is Thursday, January 26th, and Senate Economic Development, Housing and General Affairs. We have Doug back to talk about the underserved community index. I'm not sure if we started that. Are you calling it UCI or something internally? If there is a name for this yet, or
Madam Chair, so for the record, Douglas Farnham, Deputy Secretary of Agency of Administration. We're calling it the Underserved Community Index because that's the federal terminology.
okay.
I would say that I prefer to stay aligned with the federal terms just for it makes some things easier. However, if the Vermont legislature finds the term dissatisfying, we can always brand it something else in Vermont. We're not obligated to use that term.
So you don't have to be that accommodating yet. We're just trying to understand it, and that's helpful. So would you say other states have underserved community indices? Do you know how many? And are they using the same index or is it differing around the country?
So throughout the pandemic, maybe I'll brag a little bit here. Vermont has moved faster than pretty much everyone else. We obligated our coronavirus relief fund faster. We spent it faster. We also, and when I say we, I'm in this one rare case, I'm speaking of both the legislative and executive branches, how we work together as a state. I don't normally do that, but we appropriated to policy purposes that were well aligned. The White House has commented on how Vermont's approach really aligns with.
They have.
Yes. We've received praise in some of our federal pandemic programs for how we're approaching them. So when we went to create this index, we looked for other states to see if any other states were doing this. We're taking the federal definitions and trying to define more clearly what were underserved communities in their states. We were unable to find any other state parallels. The closest we found in some of our programs, we introduced a BIPOC priority, and we felt that was, without writing a full justification case, we felt that was fairly safe to prioritize BIPOC businesses in most of those programs. Because also there was some precedent that the legislature chose to prioritize BIPOC in several cases. Yep. So we said, we doubt that anyone will protest if we do this. And we didn't have any issues with that. So other states had prioritized BIPOC communities. They prioritized identity-based communities, basically referring back to decisions they'd made previously about those identity-based communities. Geographical communities, I think the states are still pretty disparate on how they think of them. I think kind of the discussion in the House that we've had so far about this really highlights that indexes can be challenging. I think when you highlight a need, some people view that as a negative, and we're not trying to be negative. We're trying to say we are seeing, we saw a lack of participation. We saw a need to identify a group that we could help participate. And that's kind of how we came about generating it. The other state materials that we, after looking for other states, we drew on the Vermont Social Vulnerability Index. And the Rural Capacity Index was an index generated by a nonprofit third-party organization that it was generated during the pandemic, so it's a more recent index.
Who generated the capacity index?
I can get that answer for you, Senator, but
is that national or state?
It's national. Not knowing the name, I don't believe it's a fully centrist, fully nonpartisan organization. I think they do have center-right leanings, to be candid.
Yeah.
I think I don't think it's a completely unattached.
They did good work. It's good to look at.
Right. So the Rural Capacity Index is one reason we didn't just try to use that, was that it did seem to have a specific perspective that it was going for. And we wanted to try to balance the capacity side with the need side in Vermont, because we know Vermont is a complex state. We have some extremely progressive individuals, we have some conservative individuals, and we all try to work together instead of defaulting to one perspective or the other.
I know Senator Harrison has done, I don't want to put her on the spot, but she's looked at what happens after the top towns, right? I mean,
Mhm.
the top towns, they're small, and of course, to the federal government, they're probably a little bit microscopic, right? I mean, I think they think most of Vermont is rural,
Yes.
but we're here looking deeper at rural capacity in our state. I applaud that. When you get below all the small towns on top, I think some funny things happen with the population centers. They're in an order that might not speak to the common reasonable person as where the need is. It might be a matter of they have half of a certain position, but more of a different position.
Yes.
Senator Harrison, I don't know if you wanted to speak to your observations at all.
Sure, well, a couple of questions first, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I didn't realize that there's a federal index. Did you look at how the federal index is calculated?
So there's a federal definition, a high level definition.
Okay,
And then the feds leave the discretion up to the states to further define and identify what their underserved communities are.
okay,
So this index was our attempt to identify those communities. So yes, the feds kind of, especially with state fiscal recovery, they publish the rule, they publish the parameters, and there are multiple areas in there where they give guidance, but it's still up to the states. And in this case, the state legislature created all those programs within that, within those barriers that the feds created. But they stayed away from, with the exception of income limits, which I personally wish they hadn't set income limits themselves because we use different income limits in Vermont, but the income limits are the one area where the feds actually use numbers and broadband.
right,
But for most of it, they leave it up to the state. And I would say what you're seeing is not surprising. One thing that we have, one massive benefit of talking through things like this with the legislature is that everyone can look at and know their list of communities and point out inconsistencies very
Right.
quickly.
right.
So one
Yes,
thing we
you've got
found,
ability to truth it.
yeah. So on the capacity side, we are pulling the town administrator and university presence indicators. And right now we're looking at replacing them. We're making the population, we're going to bucket that differently and probably looking at right now 7 buckets, 7 tiers. And we're looking at the municipal budget per capita is actually a really interesting way to look at towns in Vermont. We have a range of $300 spent per capita up to over $5,000 spent per capita by a municipality. So there's a massive spectrum of how much a municipality is spending per member of that municipality, and we want to recognize that.
And that's a pretty interesting,
Yeah,
because can be a choice of the municipality. Are you assuming that that's the choice that the municipality is making? I mean, in some cases,
Well-
there might be taxing capacity that's not being used.
Yes, and that's
So
why we
that's
have
a
the
very-
municipal grand list is going to be another variable that we add
Okay.
in.
Okay, so
To
you're gonna
represent-
change this.
Yes, the capacity side in particular, we are,
okay.
we're meeting with several legislators and VLCT to talk about how we
Good.
think we can. We explored a measure related to roads and unpaved versus paved.
Yes, ooh,
It turns out that's very controversial.
Right.
People feel strongly, and sometimes not paving a road is a choice.
oh, very much so.
Exactly, yeah.
But we do have full towns that do not, I represent a town that does not have a single paved road.
Correct.
Are they?
But it's at a data level, you can't separate the towns that choose to pave their roads and
Right.
choose the towns that can't pay for it.
Right.
So that's what the municipal grand list factor is intended to represent is
Okay,
what's the tax base in that town? How
Right.
much tax could they theoretically raise if they chose to?
I don't know if you're at liberty to say, but what I don't want to happen is there's multiple groups meeting. Senator Harrison and Senator Clarkson, we're going to join some House members in talking about the index,
That
Representative
is
Marcotte and
tomorrow.
others.
it's either tomorrow, possibly today, but
Is that
That
you?
is the
like
group I was
No,
looking
okay,
at,
great.
Madam
Can't
Chair.
send out an invitation.
Yes, we're
for
only
tomorrow,
meeting
which
with
is a
one group of
little
legislators.
challenge.
so I believe
Okay.
you're
Yes.
in that.
yes.
Perfect. I didn't.
Okay,
I
good.
wanted to make sure
good.
you were included.
Yes,
I was gonna say, you're included, as I recall from that.
Okay, that's
So-
really helpful. So you're gonna be part of those, which I think is really great.
right.
Great.
So I would say from the administration's perspective, we feel good about what we published. From a scientific perspective, it was a reasonable way to approach it. However, once you get into the nuance, we can improve it. We can modify it to make it more accurately capture the nuances in some of Vermont's smaller and medium-sized towns. And I think that'll be very valuable. We're definitely not wedded to the original form of
Good.
it.
Just a couple more questions.
Yeah, of course.
Is there any other process in the state that categorizes towns?
So generally speaking, and actually Chris Cochran is more of an expert than I am at this, but from what I've seen from working at the tax department and from interacting with community development, historically Vermont tends to just draw a line related to population level. And we talk about it and then we figure out what the right line is. But then below that population level, everyone has the same access. And we hope that people that don't need the program don't approach the program, and people that need it more are able to access it. So I think that's the most common method, is based on the town size.
I might interject just to say, I'm very attached to the environmental justice, principles we set forth last year, which in a way that doesn't divide urban and rural. We started to talk about who has low spending per capita, who has degraded infrastructure, who has undesirable land uses in higher quantities in their communities. And that process is underway. I mean, that was supposed to be set in motion so that advisory council could come together and create a map of the state that talked about whose infrastructure and whose environmental benefits aren't being experienced to the same level.
Madam Chair, I would say we evaluated the work that's been done on that index and the direction it's moving in. And it's, I think, an excellent lens for looking at environmental justice. It is a very different lens from what we're looking at here, because of a lot of things that are measured. If you look at the map of how the current index measures impact, it does actually tend to, in reality, favor the rural or favor the urban areas. It shows a higher impact because most of the elements that are included in the index only exist in urban areas. Many of these smaller towns don't have degrading infrastructure because they have no infrastructure. So from an environmental perspective, I'm sorry, that was a very blunt way to put it.
No, but
That's
it's true.
actually helpful.
Yeah, but I would like to look at how you're measuring that, because
Yes.
we started with thresholds that really captured rural populations who have higher poverty levels.
Mhm.
And then we looked at where there's limited English proficiency and higher populations of people of color. But that is an existing federal map. It's one of the most detailed federal maps that exists with EJ screen. And now they're beta testing a climate vulnerability index. So I would just challenge that. I don't know, if the state has done a good enough job ever mapping, sort of who experiences environmental benefits. They're not all infrastructure, they're health related, they're lead poisoning related. There are a number of indicators that exist in the federal framework, that flooding vulnerability, heat vulnerability. So I challenge that it leaves out rural communities.
I didn't mean to imply it leaves it out, but I would say more of the variables apply to an urban setting than a rural setting. So it wasn't a light switch type situation where it leaves them out completely. But when I looked at the map and overlaid it over our population centers, it had a strong correlation. The social vulnerability index also had a fairly strong correlation, although that was a bit more mixed. If you actually look at the national social vulnerability, Vermont actually scores rather well relative to other states on social vulnerability. So that's.
So I don't know, Senator.
Well, I guess just one other major question is, if this index is going to be used for years, then I think obviously we need to take more time to get it right. If it's just going to be used for the $3 million, I believe it is, that needs to get out quickly, it doesn't have to be as close to perfect, in my opinion.
So the intended use of the index is for this to expedite the release of this $3 million. To get a list that admittedly not perfect, but good enough to give us a first round of releases. And then I know House of Commerce was particularly interested in an appeal process, so town could come to AOA and say, we really should be on your list. And for AOA to look at the facts of that town and to say, okay, you know, the conditions in your town, we can add you to the technical support.
Right, it's just funny because the people who would likely need to appeal don't have the capacity to do that. I mean, it's
Right.
just,
I think that's true. I think it all depends on how we interact with them. If we go
Sure.
overly formal and rigid with the towns, like we do in many of our programs, then yes, they won't have the capacity to get through an appeal. If we approach them in a reasonable manner, have a conversation with them, and we don't box it in with too much process and formula and criteria. I mean, anytime you give discretion to an administrative official, that's a consideration. If it's long-term discretion, that's more troubling. If it's short-term discretion, you can sometimes go with who you know is making the decision and do we trust that individual or not to behave fairly. But discretion is always a tough call. The other use of the index is not truly long-term, but is for ARPA programs that are running through 2026. We've looked at it, and I know before I cited 4 or 5, there are 3 programs where the use of the index would be strongly appropriate. And most other programs, it might enter as a weighting factor after we talk to the program staff if they feel it's appropriate. But for most of them, it's kind of it's not as certain that it would actually be very appropriate, because some of the programs like 3 acre stormwater, they don't necessarily serve these populations that we're trying to provide assistance to. So the Risky Systems program is $10 million of water for small residential water systems. The legislative language there clearly signaled an intent to prioritize smaller rural communities. Of course, the Act 172 has its own prioritization mechanism, and we are actually trying to align our index more with some of the criteria from Act 172, which is the Municipal Energy Resilience Program. Distance from an urban center is how the Act 172 program is contemplating geographic location. And we're also going to look at integrating distance from an urban center into our capacity side of the index. So I think that's one of the new variables we're considering to replace town administrator and presence at the university. We found the town administrator data to be, after we dug into it and got enough examples, it was like, okay, this is not representative of the towns.
right, I think it is somewhat representative,
Yeah.
but I would have given it
Yeah, not as much as we had hoped.
a middle score, you know, like a 50 rather than 100 or 0, like a 50 or a 0, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It certainly is an element of a town's capacity,
Oh, I would think so.
because,
Senator Parks.
Phil, no, you.
No, and I have more, we'll
You
talk
have
later.
yeah.
So that's good.
So I have a question for you, because I found out the other night at the Working Lands meeting that Brian at the new Paul Costello, Brian's last name, I'm just punting at the moment, but who runs it? What?
Low, I believe.
Okay, right.
Oh,
Who runs
sorry,
the Vermont Council on Rural Development,
yes, right.
has actually gotten $10 million of earmark from Leahy to do very similar work, not necessarily to help all the towns access the IRA infrastructure and ARPA money, but to do very similar capacity building, helping to visualize and then helping implement them through the project's completion. That it's similar enough so that it strikes me that, and they are one of the partners on helping roll this out, that it would be great to also bring them into the conversation and figure out how we can make these 2 efforts work together, because they have a whole lot more money. They could identify more towns. I think it's for, do you remember what it's for? It's for 20 towns, I think.
Yeah, so there.
And it's very exciting. And I think it dovetails in a very constructive way, because part of this is getting, our objective here is to help towns access and fully use all the federal money that's been put on our plate in all these different programs. And that's part of what they're trying to do too.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it just strikes me as we go forward that we should be working together hand in glove so that we don't duplicate effort and that we use up all that money in constructive ways.
Absolutely, Senator. We have started having conversations with Brian about that program and how the two can
Good.
interact together and how
Right.
we can avoid duplication.
Now that,
I think one of the biggest ways we will avoid duplication there is that funding, a significant amount of funding is also for a narrower type of projects. So it'll help the towns build capacity in a certain lane, but it won't help them with some of the general scoping as much. But we are still early in the conversations, and yes, I think we would absolutely want to coordinate with them and make sure we're not duplicating. I think we also asked that, if they were going to be one of the areas that responded to the retainer agreements or not. I think there's a lot of potential there to make sure we work together. And I think that's been extremely important in rolling out the ARPA with all the programs created in all the different agencies. We have a very high level of activity in Vermont between projects towns are initiating by themselves, projects coming out of A&R, V-Trans. We have a lot going on. So coordination is amazingly important right
coordination
now.
is key.
How are you defining an urban center?
So we haven't settled on a firm definition. That's one thing I wanted to talk about tomorrow. The census uses 5,000.
Okay,
So
the US Census uses 5,000.
yes, and that's actually the threshold for what they define as rural. So below
Oh.
5,000, they define as rural. So by default, it's not rural.
Right,
It's
you gotta
kind of-
have some threshold.
Yeah, so the 5,000 is what we're contemplating use for Act 172 for distance from a population center of 5,000 or more, which is a little over 20 towns in Vermont.
Okay. And I don't want to comment too much, but I think what was concerning before was the gradient level, right? That with the capacities, like you get 0, 50, or 100.
Right,
And if there's a way to create a much more,
absolutely.
granular gradient there, that would be helpful because
Yes,
a lot
population,
of towns are somewhere near a place of 5,000.
right. Population was 150, 0. Now it'll be in steps of 14%. So
Okay.
it'll go 186, 72. So it'll wind down a little bit more.
Just to follow up on the urban rural, they can be completely different economically. You can have a high income urban center surrounded by rural low income, or you can have low income
Mhm.
urban surrounded by high income
Yeah.
rural.
Yeah,
Yes,
So that makes a huge difference on the capacity
yes. I
or
think
the need, I
it
guess.
shows up
if-
more in the
If we
need
want to show
indicator.
need,
Right.
but need is huge,
and
I would say.
well,
I do feel like the need in sub-index that we created, I do feel like presents a pretty strong holistic view that's very nuanced. It does look at percentage of income above 150% of FPL, labor force participation, population growth or loss. So it does provide more of a snapshot of the need, the affluent.
where
of
is
that
the
committee.
need in that? I'm sorry, I'm just trying to find all the different various indexes in your report.
In the spreadsheet,
I can give you the paper.
It's in this.
Like,
Called need subsidy, sub-index.
Okay, I haven't seen
Yes.
that. I
the
have
need
to-
sub-index. And obviously, we'd be open to
Needs
adjustment
sub-index.
if people felt strongly.
Why
but I
do
think-
you, I'm sorry,
There's a list
why
of
do
characteristics.
you use above 150? Why don't you just do the
That's the one that
income
says
per person?
orientation at the top.
Because
Yeah, it's,
the income
yeah, it says
above
orientation
150%
at the
is
top.
the available
Got it.
data at the census level. Vermont
It doesn't
doesn't
work
have
for-
some of the other thresholds that we like to set. We don't have the data to support
Oh,
it
I've
necessarily.
seen it in other places.
It's estimated data. So I know some of the processes that go into estimating those other thresholds, unless it's based on tax data. And we couldn't ask the tax department to work on this research because it didn't have a taxation purpose. It would have, could have been considered.
Actually,
relevant.
long-term, that's not true. Long-term, if all these projects happen, the tax base will go up in all these towns because the grand list will
Right.
improve and hopefully these communities will be more sustainable.
So-
in the future. So actually it does have big tax.
The primary reason we used 150 was that it was the census threshold. And if there's another reliable data set, we're happy to look at it. And if it's preferable, we're happy to replace the income indicator. I think wherever you draw the line of income the percentage up and above and below, it's a relative, we're comparing the different communities. So as long as we're comparing apples to apples, I think it's a good indicator.
Yeah, unless some communities are very much more poor. I know that's bad.
Right,
It's not good
right.
wording.
Are much
Yeah.
poorer.
Right, and
you can
and
see it
at
in
the
the data,
very
I
low
guess.
levels.
Right.
And I'm just not familiar with the above 150, so I can just take a look at it in the
Yeah.
meantime and see if it does.
If you're below
'cause that just
150,
seems like
you
a
are
higher-
not able to make ends meet. You are not able to independently support yourself generally at 150% of federal poverty level. That is quite low.
But then, like, if your community has, for example, a lot of folks in the 80% level versus the 80 to 150, that might be a different type of community.
Right. Yeah, and that's where you get into the nuances of a particular community. A community may have, you see some very divided communities where they have a large population of extremely low income, and then they have a large population of extremely high income.
Right.
And I think if this was intended to be a general policy tool applied like for the next 20 years in Vermont, you might want to try to study those differences and generate a more comprehensive view of the communities. Which of course, if you're trying to maintain that, would be a massive effort to try to maintain. But I do think the reason we used the census table was we felt it was representative, it was available, and for short-term uses felt appropriate.
Okay. For sure.
Any final questions? I'm really glad the working group is in place. Anyone else can share other thoughts with the working group?
Right, yes. So it's a challenge because it's been scheduled in the middle of committee time. So I still haven't had, so that's a problem.
Right.
So I need to check with Bruce, which I haven't had a chance.
Oh, okay. I was like, yeah, we lose 2 weeks.
Actually, I think it's scheduled on floor time. Isn't it 1 p.m. tomorrow?
Oh, tomorrow we're on the floor at 11:30.
Oh, sorry, my calendar.
1 o'clock is,
Sorry.
It's a newbie thing.
that's okay.
Thank you so much, Doug. We
Doug,
appreciate
thanks.
you. I mean, we like indices if they help us, make better decisions. So
Can you send out a new version of where you are now that you've adjusted so much of this? Is that possible, or will we get that tomorrow at the working group?
I'm hoping a new version will be available tomorrow.
Okay.
We just arrived on the new ways to segregate the data yesterday, and I'm having the team run through the statistical checks to make sure we're not actually violating any error principles and things like that. So we use the same statistical standards used for the social vulnerability index, and we don't want to bias the data by dividing it up the way we think it might make sense. So I think that's one of the challenges, but I hope to have a new version to look over tomorrow. Yes.
Right. Terrific.
thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
So Megan, you're the witness chair, and is Gary your witness or is he?
Well, he's your witness, but
Okay,
I,
okay, you have invited.
at the
is you
invitation to invite
Okay.
somebody, Gary is.
And is he?
on Zoom.
On Zoom, okay, great, so we'll let you set the stage.
I let him know, I don't know if you let him know as well, but he might have a little more time if I'm starting early.
Oh,
So I
okay.
appreciate the opportunity. So for the record, Megan Sullivan, I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. The Vermont Chamber is the largest state-owned business organization. We represent small, medium, large businesses in every industry across the state of Vermont, and appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about your omnibus housing bill. I'm just going to sort of start big picture on workforce. There are, and Senator Ron Hinsdale, I know you've used this before, but there are, over 20,000 job openings in the state. So if we had a unemployment rate at 0 and we told every graduating kid that they have to stay in Vermont, or they chose to stay in Vermont, we would still have a lot of job openings. We just don't have enough people in the state to fill the openings that we have. I had the opportunity to read a report from JFO. I brought one copy. I don't know, this issue brief on demographics. It's on their website, but if anyone would like to see it, I've got it here.
Pass it around.
And there's a line from it that I want to read. Unless Vermonters age 65 and older decide to leave Vermont in droves, or younger working age people flock to the state in great numbers, Vermont's ratio of old to working age people will continue to rise, placing a greater burden on workers to support both young and old. Now, Kelly from AARP was supposed to be here before me, and I know at some point she'll come in and she is going to say, what I would echo is that our mature Vermonters, our sage Vermonters, are an incredibly important part of our community, and we don't want them to leave in droves. We want them to have an opportunity to stay and age here, which means we need to ensure Vermont's secure, sustainable, and equitable future by attracting more working age people here. But recent graduates, seasoned professionals alike are deterred from taking jobs here or remaining here because of the housing shortage. We know that legislators from every party, businesses from every industry, communities across the state have all agreed that housing is a fundamental challenge for Vermonters right now. And while that's going on, we continue to see stories in the news, which was highlighted in an op-ed that the Vermont Chamber did with AARP and Vermont Professionals of Color Network, about communities where housing developments are being downsized, are being delayed, or being derailed, usually by a few individuals who are looking at local and state zoning pieces in order to impact the ability for those housing developments to move forward, and saying, not in my backyard. And I think most concerning is when those yards have really benefited from state investment in infrastructure. 7 years ago, the Vermont Futures Project, who I hope may be coming into this committee at some point, they are much better at data and figures than I am, but they set a target of 5,000 new homes per year to meet the demand. And since that in 2016, we've seen, especially in the last few years, hundreds of millions of dollars invested in housing, but the crisis continues to worsen. VHFA has come out with updated numbers that are even higher than where Vermont Futures Project was 6 years ago. So we know that money alone can't solve this problem. I did a quick look on Indeed, which is just one job posting, and there were 8,900 jobs posted that pay over $45,000 a year, which is usually the salary that someone would be making if they can afford a $200,000 home. I then compared that, so that's all jobs over $45,000. Compared that to Zillow, what's available in the market, 200,000 to 400,000 across Vermont, 57 homes. 9,000 job openings, 57 homes available. There is a mismatch between the workers that we need and the houses available for them to live in, to work here and call Vermont home. The proposals that are in the omnibus bill that you're considering are great steps at reducing those barriers, getting at solutions that aren't just putting money to the problem. We know that investments are important and need to continue, but we also need to reduce the barriers because we need a continuum of housing. If right now we have affordable housing or subsidized affordable housing and people who can buy a $700,000 home on 10 acres, we're missing the opportunity for people to move through the continuum, to grow their careers and their families in Vermont. And this bill gets at the idea of equity in, or I should say, economy of scale by creating density. If you can build a house for a duplex for a little more than you can build a single family home, you're creating affordability and economy of scale. It also reduces the cost by the amount that a developer is going to be spending on permits and legal fees for going through all of these processes in a way that really looks at where do we want housing? What's a smart growth area way to do this? So since 2019, wages in the state have gone up 21% according to DOL data. So
Sorry,
employer,
since for what's the time?
2019 to second quarter of 2019 to the second quarter of 2022, 21.8%. In this past year, we saw an 8% increase in wages. So employers are raising wages. But we know that housing is still out of reach as wages have gone up. And so employers are taking that next step of saying we can't continue to lose employees or lose recruits to the state because of this. And so the employers that can are getting involved in trying to find solutions. A anchor employer in the state of Vermont and a hugely important player as we have these aging demographics, the University of Vermont Medical Center is one of those employers that is trying to participate in how to get to solutions. They are building a 300 units of housing in South Burlington. They have 1,200 job openings. So it's a piece, but it's not everything. We need opportunities for their employers and for their employees and for all employees, whether they're the entry-level healthcare worker who's looking to get trained and grow a career here, or a seasoned professional that we want to recruit to the state and their family, like Gary is, and we're looking forward to hearing from Gary to say that you can come here even if you need affordable housing or if you have a higher income, and this can be a place where you can attain housing in an affordable way for your family.
Gary is here on the screen with a beautiful background. It looks like West Virginia to me, but.
You're muted, Gary, sorry.
So I think, am I muted? Because I'm not
I
muted.
think we need to turn up the volume, Mr. Scott, before it could have been.
Tell me how to do it. Do I just hit this?
Can you guys hear me now?
Okay, Gary, go.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
A little better. We're gonna.
Yep.
All right, so thank you guys for having me. My name is Gary Scott. This background is Uganda, Africa, by the way, so not anywhere in the States. But
Where is it?
that is Murchison Falls in Uganda, Africa.
Oh, it's
Wow.
Uganda.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that as high as it'll go? Huh, weird. Okay, it's just not as loud as we'd like to have it, Gary.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure where to start. Do you guys want to ask me questions, or should I just share my experience coming to Vermont?
I think your personal, your experience coming to Vermont is valuable. As Megan set up, you all have a lot of job openings and are trying to build housing. What that experience has been like. I bent the ear of your new CEO yesterday about shared housing, home share systems, and getting nurses into the neighborhoods around the hospital with home share situations, but that's my own pet issue. So just, what you have the floor for a little under 20 minutes.
Okay, I don't think I'll take that long, but let me just share my personal background. So I came here in 2020, November of 2020, and I moved into a hotel and ended up having to stay in a hotel for over 7 months because I just couldn't find anywhere to stay. Every place that I tried to get, there were immediate cash offers over and above the asking price. So coming here as a what I would call an upper middle class salary, still not been able to find a place until I was able to contact someone who knew someone. And it took me 7 months. When I got here, it was wintertime, so there was not a lot for me to do or people for me to know. But until I made relationships at work and found someone to actually help me, I was trapped in a hotel. And I can't tell you, during COVID, pandemic, cyber attack, the mental health challenges that you faced in a hotel for 7 months. You're alone, family's not here. But even after that, trying to find permanent housing that I could afford, coming from Texas, where my wife and kids, we have a nice home there, 5 bedrooms, two-car garage, whatever. Trying to find something that's comparable to that in Vermont was just not possible. And so you have to make decisions on whether or not you want to bring your family here and take a step down in terms of your housing situation. And even if I could have found housing, it was not attractive for us as a family. And then it was just not affordable. You know, I think the only house we really looked at and thought about purchasing was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home. And it was over $750,000. And not a huge home, small home. So just the challenges of trying to relocate here as what I would consider an upper middle class family and having challenges. I can only imagine what entry-level workers are making trying to afford housing here. So we're trying to be creative at the University of Vermont Medical Center in terms of trying to partner with folks, developers, to try to come up with employee housing. These are things that we used to do back, 100 years ago or 50 years ago or so as an employer, trying to make sure our folks have housing. It's been a challenge. We've had folks move here and actually, it's sad to say, but have to stay in their car for a little while. And that's not how we should treat people. I think Vermont is a great place, a lot to offer. But unless we can get folks to come here and have housing for people, I think we're setting ourselves up for a future that may not be as bright as we would want it to be. Housing is a big part of why people take jobs in different states. If it's affordable here, and I'm not saying low income housing, I'm just saying affordable housing, even for everyone from all spectrums. So the challenges for me, I think were very unique. I am a vice president coming here and having challenges finding housing, not only because I didn't know anyone, but the real estate agent that I used, every place she brought me before I can even get an offer in, that were 27, 20, 25 offers, way over the asking price. And these places would take significant amount of money before you could even move in. So in addition to not having the volume of housing that we need, the ones that do come on the market are just not affordable for the everyday person. My departments that I manage are a lot of the entry-level folks, the folks that clean the hospital, EBS, food services, maintenance, security. And I hear from my folks on a daily basis how hard it is to find housing here and the challenges associated with housing and childcare. Childcare is a separate issue, I know, but it kind of ties together. So I've also worked with folks in the community who come here as refugees from Afghanistan, and the challenges that some of those folks face in finding housing. Though we have a lot of nonprofits that work with those people, housing is still a challenge. So Vermont is a great place. I think we have a lot to offer. If only we could work on housing. I don't have the answers, but I think being creative, like what we're trying to do with working with different developers, trying to bring on employee housing will make a difference for us, but not for the entire state.
Thank you. Any questions? It is really heartbreaking to hear about your employees sleeping in their cars, just trying to work in our hospitals and save lives. That's frightening. Senator.
And I'm just curious, where did you finally land? And the other challenges, how far from your job? I mean, how far are you having to commute now? Because that's another piece as we look at climate resiliency and climate, how we reduce our global warming impact. Right. It's like one of our challenges is how much further people are having to commute to their work. Yeah, so can you give us a notion?
Yeah, I was lucky. I talked to my boss, who has been a lifetime Vermonter. He knew someone who was able to find me a place after I moved.
That's frustrating.
Yeah, very frustrating.
Great for you, but frustrating for everybody else.
Yeah. So I landed about 4 miles from the job, so I don't have a long commute. My job is, I could bike. I can bike to work. I can't walk to work, but I can bike to work. And my job is such that I have to be here at the drop of a dime sometimes. So I'm close. I'm very lucky, and it worked out for me.
You gotta know somebody.
But we had an employee that we were pursuing a very bright engineer that we needed to have on our team to help us with our future master planning. And he refused the offer because of housing. He and his wife looked around for housing. He was like, Gary, we just can't afford to live there. Very bright guy.
Right.
I mean, he was a brilliant guy. And we lost him because him and his wife felt like they couldn't afford to move here.
Yeah, we've heard that from several employers, sadly.
Senator Brock.
You mentioned that in looking at a variety of houses over time, there was a tremendous amount of competition over the asking price. Based on how you wound up after finding a recommendation, do you feel you got value for what you paid, or do you think you overpaid?
Good question.
So I'm renting because I can't afford to buy. And I do feel like I'm overpaid. You know, what I'm paying for a 2-bedroom apartment townhouse here would be a lot less in Texas or Alabama, where I was born and raised.
But the places that you've been at before, do they have a housing problem like Vermont has, or is Vermont unique
So I think
in your experience?
in my experience, Vermont is unique. I've never had issues. I've been all over the country. I've worked in Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio, Florida, Macon, Georgia, Atlanta, Georgia, Birmingham, Alabama, Adamsville, Tennessee, Dallas, Texas. I've never, ever faced challenges like I faced when I got to Vermont. In Dallas, at the time when I moved there, there were approximately 1,700 people relocating to Dallas a day. And we were never having housing issues. In Dallas, when you see the trend moving up, people build. You're allowed to build. You're attracting so much talent and businesses into Dallas that the governments allow you to, there are no restraints on taking care of housing. So I've never ever seen a challenge like I've seen in Vermont. Vermont is a very unique state.
Thank you.
No, I'm fine. I mean, welcome.
I'm curious, Gary, you know, what's making you stay right now, given all of those challenges? I mean, we're lucky we haven't lost you too.
Yeah.
What do you tell people as they're looking and trying to stay?
And where's your family?
So my family is still in Texas right now. I have a senior in high school that once he graduates, he's gonna come up here. Not sure if the entire
Right.
family will relocate right now because of the housing situation and the ability to not be able to afford a house, or the inability to afford a housing. But you know, Vermont, for me, I can't speak for everyone, but for me, my job matters to me. It has a lot in terms of defining who I am as an individual. And so when I'm happy on my job, I'm pretty happy everywhere else. So I'm happy at the medical center. I value the work that we do. I love the work that we do in serving our community and serving Vermonters. We have an uphill battle in terms of serving this state over the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, but we're up for the challenge. And the joy and the satisfaction that I get from working at the medical center and serving Vermonters plays a big part in why I stay. I'm not a cold weather guy at all. I never thought that I would be back in the North at all. But since I've come here, what has been very important for me is that I've had to seek out community, to be honest with you. I've had to find community of folks to be around, to spend time with, to connect with. And that's a diverse group of people. But it's not as easy as it seems. You have to be someone who puts yourself out there. So me having this connection, this group of people and they're from all backgrounds and walks of life, having that community and having the work relationships on my job and what we do for this community makes me love Vermont. I'm not a skier, so I'm not gonna lie to you and tell you I snow ski or I love the winters or I snowboard or snowshoe. I don't do anything in the winter, but the spring and summer and fall are the absolute best here than anywhere I've ever been.
Oh, great.
That's
Maybe
great.
we'll get you out ice fishing from Los Angeles, and that was my first winter sport.
I don't think so.
It is a little scary when you walk out on the ice for the first time.
Oh,
Yeah. Not if you're a drinker club, but anyway, so Mr. Scott, I'm sure you're very busy. I don't know if anybody has any more questions.
No.
We can let Megan sort of wrap up on the themes for the last few minutes. We really appreciate your time and we appreciate you being here and persevering
Yes.
through all of that. It shouldn't be this much of a struggle to become a Vermonter.
Yeah, and you may become our poster person for the outdoor recreation industry. 3 months of and 3 seasons of the year. And it's great to have you to be our voice for a need we are all sadly very clear on.
Well, let me say thank you guys for having me. And in whatever way you guys need me to serve, I'm open to serving. Thanks for your time today, and I hope it's been valuable. And I look forward to hearing from you guys for whatever you may need from me in the future.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Good day.
And wonderful, but he loves his job.
Yeah,
Loves his job enough to put up with.
we have good jobs, right? We have great
Great job.
employers, great jobs. No one
Great
knows.
jobs. There's so many amazing things that just happen hidden in the hills and valleys in Vermont of.
And it's amazing the number of people who are living far, far away from their jobs. I think I mentioned
Yeah.
before, I have a nurse who's contacted me about the housing situation, and she lives in Highgate and commutes back and forth every day because that's the only place that she could find a place to rent that she could afford, and she's not earning minimum wage by any means.
And that's to Northwest. She's commuting to.
Yeah, well, no, not to Northwest.
Oh.
She goes to UVM Medical Center in Burlington every day from Highgate,
From Highgate?
from Highgate.
Yeah, one of my daughters in-laws is an emergency room nurse, and she commuted from Enosburg
Right,
to Burlington. I think she's recently gone to Northwest.
right. I'm hearing the same thing from the senior living community folks, that they're living in Waterbury, commuting to Burlington every day for work.
Well, that's Waterbury, Burlington is standard.
Well, yeah, but it's
Yeah.
like they place them there as a starting point, and they're like, really far away.
We hear, I mean, in every industry, healthcare certainly, but even a manufacturing member of ours who works with Second Chance employees to get them out of corrections or substance abuse and into jobs that say that even in, Memorial County, they can't find a place to work, so they live in the Northeast Kingdom. And they already have transportation issues, cars that are unreliable. That adds an hour, if you're driving an hour each way, that adds 2 hours of childcare that's needed. Finding opportunities and employment hubs in our smart growth areas to say, how do we build density so that we can add to this continuum. Again, we're supportive of continued strategic investments. We also know that breaking down barriers to allow this market to work better is going to be important. The Missing Middle program last year was an investment in middle housing. I think that was gone in a month. There are some interesting proposals that we're excited about that would allow employers that aren't the UVM Medical Center that can figure out how to do employee housing
I wonder if that's going on our insurance bill.
Oh,
well, that are frustrated, they're entrepreneurial and say, this is a problem and we need to be involved in solving it. They are not developers, they're not in real estate.
Yeah.
This is a totally different business for them. And so an opportunity for them to invest in the creation of housing. There's a proposal that's been worked on that I think may be coming out in a House bill that we're excited about, that could provide employers that opportunity to invest in housing that could get at this workforce missing middle housing program. So
we've heard about a lot of different housing bills,
Yeah.
with a lot of different ideas. We're gonna get to funding next week and look at incentives for commercial residential and,
great.
employer supported, but share any ideas that you have, Senator Brock.
I don't.
Oh, okay. Senator Harrison.
I have a question. You have builders and developers as your, as some members, I would think, right? Obviously, they need employees, and we're looking at the career and technical centers, but is there anything we should know about from that sector
We'll hear from the home
in
builders.
terms of increasing their capacity,
Hopefully
or
we'll
are
hear
we hearing
home
from them?
builders.
We're hearing from them. but you
Oh,
can
okay,
say-
Yeah.
okay.
I think it highlights that every industry is struggling to
Right,
find people
okay.
right now, and it's just constant.
So, how we can support employers who are interested in developing housing. It's something we looked at briefly last year with, thank you, with the project in Springfield, with Matt Dunn's project in Springfield. That was very specific to that, but it raises the bigger issue in Cooper being in, talking about his housing he's had to create for his employees. I think there is sort of a place, I don't think we've figured out how we can enable employers. And so if you could come back to us maybe with a proposal on how we could specifically help employers who are so disposed to invest in this, and what would make it worth it for them, and I think that would be kind of actually an interesting aspect to this bill, is because we want to do it for all employers, not just one, which has been sort of our problem. But
Yeah, and there is a proposal floating out there that I would,
Are you
I don't wanna
bringing it
jump
to us?
ahead, but I
when is it being brought to us, Chris and Megan?
Soon.
Okay, so good, because it's an
a couple
initiation, I've
weeks,
talked
yeah,
about it, and, it's hard to do it just for one, but if we could come up with a concept that worked for a number of entrepreneurial
Yeah.
businesses, that would be great.
because we have members that are interested, from large acre employers to restaurants that are just have that entrepreneurial spirit and say,
Right.
we need to be part of the solution. And
So we are eager to hear about that piece.
yeah,
Okay, so we'll have you back.
great.
And we are moving on to Katie Gallagher from Vermont Natural Resources Council. Thank you, Megan. Thank you, Gary, if he wants to stay. Yeah.
Is Carrie?
Hi, everyone.
Hi, good morning.
Can you hear me okay?
Being there and hearing there.
It's a little
Yeah.
problematic. Yes. Hi,
I
Kate.
think it feels
Hi.
like something's up with.
Oh, this is good,
This
because
is-
this is nice.
Sounds
and not
coming
working.
out of
It
there.
may have been,
Oh, yes, it's
okay,
that.
I didn't
I
know.
look there and the voice is coming behind.
Oh, I got
me.
confused if
It's
you're
a
not hearing the voice.
My instinct is to look there.
Yeah, you're coming in loud and clear.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me in this morning. Katie Gallagher. I have spoken this committee in the past in my capacity as the Sustainable Communities Program Director with the Vermont Natural Resources Council, but I believe I'm speaking to you today with my Waterbury Planning Commission hat on, and Brian Shoup will be back into the committee to speak more specifically on behalf of the NRC related to the specific provisions in the bill. But I am currently the vice chair of the Waterbury Planning Commission, member of our new Waterbury Housing Task Force, which just had our very first meeting last night, which is exciting. I'm also an active member of the Vermont Planners Association, and previously was a planner in the Mad River Valley, where I supported their nonprofit housing committee. So I am happy to be here today to talk about Waterbury's recent experience in the past 6 months or so related to housing. But if it's all right, I'd also like to share a little bit about my own personal housing experience here as a young person who's been dedicated to living and staying in Vermont. So I've been here for over 14 years, and over that time, most of it has been in Burlington, living in first the UVM dorms, and then all different types and structures of apartments and drafty old beautiful buildings. Lived in my in-laws basement for a time, and then thankfully, as of 3 years ago, we were very fortunate to be able to purchase our first home, which is a old 200-year-old single family home with an accessory dwelling unit in Waterbury Center. My partner and I benefit from having family members that have purchased their own homes, having the resources and time to be able to go through this process. And I know that you've heard from folks already about how difficult this process is, especially for first-time home buyers or folks who don't have families who have purchased homes in the past. And even for us, I just want to say and reiterate that the process was incredibly confusing and disheartening. We were looking for a house in Waterbury Center, or sorry, Waterbury in general, actually looking at first in the Village because we were hoping for a place that was in a walkable community where we could walk to the grocery store, to the elementary school. This was in 2019. I think we probably spent about 4 months or so before anything came onto the market. And when we finally found a house that fit our criteria, because we were probably naive at that point, we were ready to make an offer, even though our agent strongly cautioned us against that house because of its high cost and pretty obvious structural deficiencies. But we were like, we'll fix it up, it's fine. And then I had my mom come in, who has a background in real estate, and she said the same thing. And then I knew that we'd never hear the end of it, so we should probably move on, which was a good choice because now I've since met the couple who ended up purchasing that house, and they confirmed our luck in moving on with stories about large rodents running across their bed. So we dodged a bullet there. Unfortunately, this other young couple did not, but we got lucky and ultimately finding a home in the historic Village of Waterbury Center, which for folks who are not familiar with this area, I think it is a hidden gem, but it is separated from the Village. And so it does still require us to have to drive down to the Village to get groceries and get to the health center and all of that. So we found this home when the owners had lowered the price. This was, again, 2019, so a time of really low rates that we were able to afford. This was 3 months before COVID hit. And so we got incredibly lucky. The house, as I said, came with an existing accessory dwelling unit that was built for their grandmother before. I did want to note, and I think I might have shared this story last year when I was here, but the ADU is great for us, but it did cause complications through the purchasing process because the bank's appraiser first struggled to find comparisons to value our house because there just aren't a lot of other homes, I guess, with ADUs that were similar in the area. And because the apartment was added to the back of the house, like so many Vermont farmhouses, they just build on and on and on in the back. So it's not connected to our main living space by a finished area. There's this kind of unfinished shed in the middle. And so it doesn't actually count towards our square footage. And so we got dinged in terms of how much square footage we had in our house. And so it lowered the value of our house in that way. But the town's assessment does count that square footage. So then we get to pay more in property taxes. So just kind of a weird situation going on there. So then during COVID, we watched a lot of YouTube videos. We renovated our downstairs. And as interest rates dropped again, we decided to refinance our house and found out through that process that our house was now being assessed for more than $60,000 more than it was about a year earlier. Which, again, great for us now that we own the house, but we wouldn't have been able to come close to affording it if that was the case. And I still get notifications from our real estate agent showing up, houses that were in our price range in the area. And, I still am pretty sure that we would still be renting because there has not been, just the supply of homes have gone down even more significantly since then. So, we will probably be renovating and chipping off lead paint for the rest of our lives, but we got incredibly, incredibly lucky. And I generally feel a lot of guilt around all of my friends who are not able to find homes. And so many of whom are now, it's already kind of hard enough to live in Vermont. A lot of my friends from the University of Vermont left immediately. And as I've been trying for 15 years to convince them to come back to Vermont, now it's even harder, which is pretty sad. So given my professional background in planning, I could not resist joining the Waterbury Planning Commission when a spot opened up last year. And because I apparently like to suffer. But But at that time, it also happened to be that housing was, and still is, having this moment. Revitalizing Waterbury, which is our downtown organization, had recently worked with a consultant to produce a housing needs assessment that highlighted just how much we need homes in Waterbury. And as you were just mentioning, Waterbury is actually ahead of a lot of communities in providing homes, but we are still pretty far behind, especially in that missing middle housing section. The select board over the past year was discussing the need to create a municipal housing committee, which has now since been done, and we're starting to talk about what our priorities and goals should be and what we can accomplish as a municipal housing committee. And of course, the impact of COVID and the increased lack of supply of housing was really putting into focus just how many of our local businesses were, and again, still are, many of them in crisis because their employees cannot find housing. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with Waterbury being pretty close to Montpelier, but it is, given its central location and its proximity to ski mountains, often gets, in both a positive and a negative way, is kind of the intersection of a lot of different people and movement, which is great, but also means that a lot of folks are looking to move here and we don't have the housing for them. So for the Planning Commission, I believe we are on our 4th year of working to update our zoning bylaws. COVID got in the mix there and slowed things down, and there are some other issues, but this has been a really long process. Before my time, they decided to split up that process to make it more manageable by splitting the town into 2 sections. So essentially everything west of 89, which is the village center, and then everything on the other side of the highway, which is going up towards Stowe, Waterbury center area. So right now, we are just trying to wrap up that first phase 1, which again is after 4 years of work that's already been put into this. This past fall, we were working through some of these tough questions related to density, setbacks, dimensional requirements. We were able to use the Enabling Better Places guide that was produced a couple years ago by the Department of Housing and Community Development. That was incredibly helpful to actually be able to put in specific numbers, or at least have a reference for what we could be using to gauge where we should be heading. So there was a lot of questions about how to determine what those specifics are, especially when you're trying to have those kind of specific standards that make the most amount of sense for your community and in specific districts. So we're working through all of this, trying to talk about how far can we push density and all of these tough things that we know we're going to get some pushback on, but make it realistic and practical and something that will be supported by the community. At the same time that this was happening, this was last fall, the town was proposing to voters to sell a municipally owned vacant parcel in Waterbury's designated downtown. And they were going to sell it to Downstreet Housing and Community Development for an affordable housing project. This, on paper, was a perfect opportunity for smart growth affordable housing. The project would have allowed the town to sell the parcel, which they had been looking to do for several years. It's currently, or now it's been sold, but it was a temporary parking lot. Used to be the site of the old municipal buildings, got flooded during Irene, had to be taken down. They turned it into a parking lot for the Main Street reconstruction project that just happened. So this was a way that they could sell the parcel in exchange for affordable units that the town desperately needs. It would also allow them to sell it to Downstreet for a relatively low price, which affords Downstreet the ability to create this new development. The project is going to add over 25 units as currently proposed on, I think it's about 0.8 of an acre. So that's providing a financial benefit for the town in terms of the tax base, but also the town's utility district, which is looking for new customers to come on. And again, it's located within the designated downtown, which has been planned for growth specifically through the municipal plan and our bylaws for years. And that has been confirmed and reconfirmed by voters for, I don't know, 15, 20 years or so. So all of that said, this project was proposed and there was immediate and vocal opposition. We support constructive community input. We held 3 public hearings between August and the ultimate vote in late October. There was direct conversations between Downstreet and the surrounding neighbors of the project. But the opposition and just how strongly it came out from the very beginning led to Downstreet making several concessions at the very beginning. And again, just remember that this is leading up to the sale of the parcel. We haven't even gotten to the point of Downstreet owning this land to actually move forward with the project yet. So some of the concessions that they made, they targeted the development more toward a workforce population, which is certainly housing that we need, but they were able to kind of move it up a little bit more into that higher income bracket. They capped the building at 3 stories, even though our zoning allowed for more. 3 stories is very common in Waterbury downtown. I believe we also have some 4 stories, and that was also a very common complaint that this was out of character with the area, even though it's literally next to other 3-story buildings. They designed the building specifically with architectural features that match the character of the area, which is great, but these included things like front porches. They also are putting in a gable to set back the 3rd floor so that it appears as if it's only a 2-story building. So not only did they cap the stories, but they're trying to make it look even less to appease those residents who are concerned. And they provided preliminary design plans that were requested by the town. This is something that is not usually done at this stage because, again, Downstreet doesn't own the parcel. They're not able to get in and actually do engineering and infrastructure work. So that caused kind of further complications because now folks kind of had this schematic design to narrow in on, oh, the driveway doesn't look like it's going to be wide enough. And you're like, well, it will be wide enough. Like, that's not the problem here, right? So anyways, the good news is that the proposal did get passed. It was voted in favor overwhelmingly at the end of October. But if you spent time in Waterbury during the couple of months that this was going on, you would not have been clear. I was not clear what was going to happen at the end of this. And, you know, after the initial vote, residents still have an opportunity to petition to appeal that vote. So even after the first vote, we were still waiting, I think, a month or a month and a half into December to finalize that, to wait and see if that petition was going to come up. So
Can we pause?
Yep.
Who would they appeal to? And then Senator Clarkson has a question. Who would they appeal to in that process?
So that's a good question. I think that the appeal would be to the, in this case, it's a little bit of a unique situation in that it's the old village that owns the parcel. So Waterbury used to have a separate municipal village that now has turned into one town. So the utility district took over that village. So it's the utility district that technically owns the parcel, and that members of the utility district were voting on this because they were essentially the old village. if that makes sense. So I believe that the appeal would be to appeal the vote. So it would go back to the utility district. But I could
Okay,
double check on that.
So it's a different appeals process than Act 250. So how many appeals are allowed? How many appeals are
believe-
allowed under?
Just one. So they have the opportunity to, if they can get 5% of voters. So again, just in this case, it's just the utility district, former village. So not that many in terms of population. If you get 5% of voters, they could appeal, and I believe it would just go to a revote. But now in this process, that didn't move forward. When Downstreet does ultimately come with a specific proposal for the development, then it will go through the DRB process, in which case then we have another opportunity for an appeal through the DRB.
So I guess my question is, the additional compromise, you began at 25 units. How many did you end up with? And you haven't finished this process yet, so.
Right. Yeah, and so I think they had estimated, and I was trying to find that before, it was somewhere between, what were they saying? It was like 24 to 28 units or something like that. So I said 25 as kind of the middle ground because they didn't have a specific number yet. Yeah, so I would guess that they still don't have, or maybe they do at this point, but that specific number does depend on all those technical pieces that they still need to line up with.
Senator Harris.
Hi, Katie. So did the utility district, how did they formalize their decision? Because they won't own the property anymore, right? So did they put covenants on the property? Okay.
That's a good question. I don't believe so. I know that they made the decision to sell to Downstreet. It was a multi-year process. They had entertained other proposals and ideas probably over the past 10 years or so. They ultimately came to this decision when they said, what is the town most need? And affordable housing kind of raised to the top of the list. And since Downstreet already has 3 other projects, housing in our town, they figured that was a reasonable way to go. But there's no covenants or things like that to my knowledge on the property.
So then Downstreet might not technically be committed to that, legally committed to that, but it would be difficult publicly, obviously, for them to change their mind at this point, right?
Right. I think that's true. And I believe that was one of the concerns that was brought up.
So Katie, you're on this affordable housing task force. Does Waterbury keep a goal for how many units it would like to bring on? Your title is Sustainable Communities at VNRC. So, we're hearing the environmental concerns be weaponized, right? Around, if no new people is good for the environment. So if you could sort of zoom back out and comment on what a sustainable community looks like and what it's like to have that conversation in Waterbury.
Yeah. So I do not believe that Waterbury has a quantitative goal for units yet. There was, from the Regional Planning Commission, an assessment several years ago about what that projected number and like what our fair share would be. There was an understanding that that data was not totally accurate. And so I don't believe the town has really used that. We, in our conversation last night with the Housing Task Force, are talking about additional data that we could and should be gathering and surveys to the community to see what they think would be most useful. Our town plan and the way that our zoning has been written is explicitly guided towards smart growth. That said, because we still have a ways to go in implementing that, we have seen a lot more, and probably the majority of our development more in the outskirts and Waterbury Center, and outside of those areas that are planned for growth. And so just kind of as an example of that, in the Housing Task Force meeting that we had last night, there were several members who had recently moved to the town from, I think probably in the past 2 to 3 years, and all of them were in the center, but discussed that they were interested specifically in moving to a more walkable downtown. So they were all interested in living in the village, but had to move to the center because that's where there's more land and more housing. And so we certainly see that still, on the Planning Commission. I see the zoning reports and most new development. We do have a couple good multifamily housing projects that are happening in and near the village, but there's still a lot of single family homes in particular that are being built out in those surrounding areas that I would hope to see reduced, or at least provide other options that don't necessitate that the only way to find housing is to build a single family out in our open lands.
So as you work to help communities define what sustainable means, how do you talk about housing in the environment?
How do I think about housing in the environment? Sorry, is that what you said?
Your title and your role.
Yeah. So for me, we cannot talk about the environment in terms of natural resources or climate and climate action without talking about smart growth housing, particularly because 40% or more of our greenhouse gas emissions is related to transportation. That transportation emissions largely is coming from single occupancy vehicles. And those miles driven are because we have built our communities out and out and out of these community centers that forces us to drive, again, to get to groceries, to get to school, to get to our jobs, as we were talking about before. So until we address land use and how we plan for and develop our communities, we're never going to address that component. I also strongly believe that that smart growth development and having greater opportunities for housing and sustainable transportation in our community centers is really critical for resilience in a climate and environmental sense. I moved to Vermont from Connecticut, and I just moving to Burlington, which is a little bit outside of Vermont. It was immediate how much people actually cared about their neighbors and the environment in a way that was not the case where I grew up. And so as we think about all of these changes that are coming to our communities, both environmentally, socially, and economically, we need to have communities that have ties to each other and to where they live in order to, weather that storm, so to speak. So again, I for me personally and my professional and personal life, am probably a one-trick pony in that I talk a lot about how smart growth housing is a climate solution, and also in terms of protecting our working landscape and not fragmenting our forests and our farms, which we know are also suffering. We need to both support housing in those locations that we want it, while also ensuring that we have protections in the places where we want those.
Appreciate that, Senator Feinstein.
We heard that supported by Gary Scott in his testimony, because one of the reasons he loves living in Vermont is you can get out and enjoy it.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me?
Paige.
Sorry, I'm new. Thank you.
Sorry.
All set? Okay.
Yeah.
So we had that reconfirmed by somebody who's very frustrated by his inability to find housing and yet treasuring our our outdoors 3 seasons of the year. He was clear about that. But I mean, we have that confirmed like time and time again. And the number one, we first did our creative economy work in 2009, quality of life, reason to be here. And that is our ability to do outdoor rec and arts and performing art, everything, but outdoor, preserving our working landscape and our wildlands and forest tracks are critically important.
Senator Harris.
Hey, Katie, just a question on when you're looking at Waterbury. Did you have, or has the housing committee talked about, I'm sure you have talked about renovating old buildings and historic buildings. What amount, do you have a sense of how much that would make a difference, say if you were able to renovate all of those buildings? Like how big of a opportunity is that?
Right. I don't have a good answer off the bat. That is something that we talked about, and we have several members who are really excited about the idea of adaptive reuse. There are certainly buildings, and especially in our village center, that could be used for housing that have been vacant for a while. So that's, I think, one of those data pieces that we'd be looking to gather in the upcoming months.
Okay, thank you. And if you come upon one, especially statewide one, let us know, please.
One more question.
I'm gonna ask, parking. I assume that might be something of an issue in downtown Waterbury. The changes proposed, and I'm a former Montpelier Planning Commission member many years ago, but the parking hasn't gotten any better. It proposes that for something like the Down Street project, your zoning can't require more than 1 parking space per unit. If some of those units, maybe most of them, end up with 2 cars, that's the one thing in this proposal. I know for a lot of the older urban areas, it's an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wanting to check that out. Would that be an issue?
So that's something that several of my fellow planning commission members and I are interested in talking more about, and we haven't had an opportunity to discuss it at the planning commission level yet, but we do know and expect that that is a difficult issue. As with the Down Street project, there was pushback about removing that parking lot, even though it was always meant to be temporary and in fact was never fully occupied. In terms of the project specifically, I guess not on behalf of the planning commission, but speaking personally, Down Street still has the ability to provide more parking as they see fit. And just as a kind of part of why it would be, I think, better for the developer to have that ability to provide that flexibility rather than the municipality requiring it, is because they're also hearing pushback on other things. So we have community members who are concerned about, there should be more green space or things like that. So they're trying to balance all of these different things. So we are in an area where this project would be essentially right across the street from a transit stop. It's in our walkable downtown. So it's a place where you really don't need vehicles. So if they were able to make that decision that they're going to provide less than the parking spaces for each unit to have 2 spaces or something like that, in order to provide more green space, that is something that I would feel comfortable letting Down Street to make that decision.
Okay. And you would feel comfortable if they decide to put it all to green space or only do the one unit, you would feel comfortable that on a light night like last night, there is adequate parking available in Waterbury? That people, because if you work in Waterbury Center, there's no public transit that I know of. Not with any
There's-
regularity. And if you
Right,
work in
there's the-
downtown, then the train doesn't go there. So there is the bus.
Right. There's a commuter that goes from Route 100 down to the village. But you're right. I think we absolutely should be having a conversation about transportation in conjunction with our conversations about housing.
Fair. Well, thanks so much, Katie. We really appreciate your time and your work in Waterbury and beyond.